Okay, let's get the lighting. And yeah. All right. So yeah, we'd like I'd like to go through what sorts of cultural aspects of society have developed over this period, and how it's left its mark on the society and on the culture. History is more than just kings and queens. History is ordinary people too. And I'd like to look a little bit at what's been going on in people's lives and the cultural aspects of their lives. So obviously the first big thing that's changed is that the Church of England, Eikoku Kyokai, has established itself in two important ways. The first, well, we've got the closing of the monastery, or the monasteries. You've got the monarch established as the head of the church. We've got Protestantism as part of the national identity. The country is defining itself as Protestant, with the king or queen as the head of the church. And we're also getting a kind of bureaucracy coming in with the parish registers of births, marriages and deaths, which means that we have a record going back to that year, really. Of course, some of the records have been lost over the period of time, but we do know an awful lot more than we did before that period. In the Middle Ages, people would live and die, and we wouldn't today be able to know anything about them, whether they lived or whether they died or who they were or anything. But from 1538, you've got parish registers that you could go back to and find out, you know, who was born where, who lived where, and who married who. We talked about the monasteries and their effect on things like charity and education. So the lack of the monasteries meant that there was more social upheaval going on at that period. But from the point of view of the church in its organisation, these are some of the big things that had changed during that Tudor period. And in terms of how things looked, all right, Westminster Abbey is not really Tudor quite in itself. It was begun in the 13th century, in the Middle Ages, and I think I said these big cathedrals and important churches would take hundreds of years sometimes to build. So people would be working on it for generations to make these things, with no modern equipment, no machinery, just by hand. They worked on putting up these extraordinary buildings, which tells you again just how important all of that was to them. They would, you know, spend their lives doing it, their children's lives, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren might still be working on building the same church. And actually, I think Westminster Abbey is kind of particularly interesting because it's one of the few buildings of central London that was left standing after the Great Fire in the second half of the 17th century. A lot of London burned down at that time. So this is one of the few buildings that we've got that kind of goes back to that period. And we still, I think, you know, Westminster Abbey sort of symbolizes what's stable in our society, what's stable in our culture. The culture of the Church of England in particular gains a lot of sort of status and sense of tradition from just from the physical fact of the building being there. So this is how it would have looked like in the late 16th century, 1584. It would have looked something like this. And this is what it looks like today. Okay, it's still there, and it's still, you know, it's a part of our cultural heritage, so significant in that sense. Hi, come on in. No prints today, so you don't have to worry about prints. Okay. Yeah, so it's still the resting place of kings and queens and other national figures. So you can go and see plaques and effigies of the kind of notable people of the country, and in particular the kings and queens. So it's the sort of burial place for kind of famous national figures, and it. As I say, the church itself, the building itself, was started before the Tudor period, but it was during the Tudor period that it became that kind of central, iconic sort of place for, representing kind of the traditions of the Church of England. So, very important building from that point of view. It was called. It's got a funny kind of name. It's called a royal peculiar, which does not actually mean, kind of, in this case, peculiar doesn't really mean heng. It just means it's unique. It's a unique kind of church. There are very few of them. They are under the direct control of the king or queen. They're not controlled by a bishop or an archbishop or by any member of the church. They're directly controlled by the king or queen. And that's something that started in the Tudor period in 1560. Okay, so moving on, we've still got a variety of different types of Christian. We've got Catholics, we've got Puritans. The Catholics are, on the sort of traditional side of the church as it was before the Reformation. The Puritans are more strongly Protestant than the typical Protestants of the Church of England. And nonconformists are generally people who, for one reason or another, just don't quite agree with the Church of England and don't accept it. So religious dissent was, an important part of the society, and as we look into the 17th century, we can see religious dissent it comes to a crisis actually quite early in the 17th century, in the beginning of the Stuart reign, with something called the Gunpowder Plot, which we'll be talking about later on. So you've still got, all kinds of disagreement from different types of people who don't fit in properly with the Church of England. The greatest suspicion would be for the Catholics. Here we've got the Jesuit up here, all right, the Jesuskei, regarded as particularly dangerous people, okay? Of course, this university is a Jesuit university, so you'd be happy to know that these people were particularly suspected during the late 16th and early 17th century. In fact, right through the 17th century, the Jesuits were kind of sort of very, very much suspected of wanting to create a revolution or to change the political climate of the country. Jesuits. Here we go. They were particularly seen as potential traitors who, you might notice that Jesuit is spelled with an I here. The I and the J were considered the same letter in early modern English, and S's looked a little bit more like what we call an F now. So it looks like Jesuit, but it's actually Jesuit. Right? It's just early modern script. It's a little bit different from our modern script. So yeah, the Jesuits were particularly suspected, and we'll see during the 17th century that Catholics are going to continue to be a challenge to the established society. Okay, government. In general, the way that the government is structured is now becoming more sophisticated. The Tudors kind of basically pioneered the sort of 5 different aspects of authority under the monarch. So our, democracy that they have in, well, we call it Britain now, or the United Kingdom, but in England originally, really it's developed very slowly over a period of hundreds of years. And actually, the very beginnings were a kind of agreement between the king and the kind of the daimyo, the the Lords in the 13th century. And then slowly the agreement between the king and the Lords developed into having a parliament, having a privy council, which is kind of like close advisors to the king, and having a parliament that the king would have to go to parliament to get agreement for certain things. He couldn't do everything, or he or she couldn't do anything at all. They had to get permission from the parliament. That's going to be a big problem, the conflict between the king and the monarch, the king in fact, and the parliament in the 17th century. So this structure is going to influence the way things develop in the 17th century. So they've built up a system of parliamentary government. The king has a lot of, the king or queen has a lot of power, but there are what we call checks and balances. The king wants this, but the parliament says this. The Privy Council agrees with one side or the other. The prerogative powers are going to actually enact, and say this can become a law. This can happen. This can't happen. The civil service is responsible for saying this law has been made. Now we take these steps to put the law into action, and you're the people who are going to be putting it into action. All right, the actual sheriffs or commission of the peace. It's your job to put these laws into action. All right, so if a particular law is made, it is kind of going through this sort of it starts with the monarch, but it's going through a process of approval and going from theory into practice through an established structure, which didn't exist before. Before, the king would say, do this, you jump, and everybody would jump. Okay, you die, and that person would die. All right, the king had absolute power in the time of Henry VIII, but by the time you get to Elizabeth, she's creating a parliamentary system where power is being shared out to a greater extent. Yeah, as I say, that's going to be really important during the Stuart period, so we need to kind of have a little bit of a sense of how Parliament and the king, or the whole relationship between the king or queen and the Parliament in particular is going to be very important as we study 17th century history. We'd also seen the development of the Tudors as a Welsh family, and that becomes symbolized in the royal coat of arms with the Welsh dragon. And so these two countries, the lion has always represented England. Putting these two together on the coat of arms brings these two countries into a unity through the fact that the king or the monarch is basically from a Welsh family, but also politically Wales had come under England's control during the late Middle Ages, and so it didn't exist as an independent country. And Scotland still continued as an independent country at this time, and the question with Ireland was kind of in the balance. Parts of Ireland were effectively controlled by England, other parts weren't. Then you get, after Elizabeth dies, and there's no one else left from the Tudor family to continue as king or queen, you get James the First. Now I put James the First there. That's not quite. Yes, James the First. He's the first James of England. He's the sixth James of Scotland. So he was already king of Scotland as James the Sixth, and then he became James the First. So the dragon got taken out at this point and replaced by the symbol of Scotland, which was the unicorn. So now you've got, in the 17th century, you've got Scotland coming closer to England. It's not formally united with England until the 18th century, but it's basically, they've got the same king. All right, So in a sense, it's one country, even though it's not formally united as one country. Scotland is now clearly closely allied with England. So that's the way things are going to develop as soon as James becomes king in 1603. Okay, you got this. Okay, I don't know. Did you see that? At the bottom here, it says "Dieu est mon droit," and that's always been on the royal coat of arms. Still there today. It's French, and it goes back to Norman times. It goes back to the Middle Ages. It's a bit of a funny number, this one, because its exact meaning is not really, we don't really know exactly what it means. God and my right. James is going to understand mon droit as meaning my kingly, my right to be king. God gives me the right to be king. And that's going to be really important as well. So you might want to get used to the idea of the king being king through God as a right. Okay, James and Charles cause a lot of trouble by saying, I am king because God chose me as king. You people, you government, you parliament, you people, you can't tell me what to do. I'm king because God chose me. Right? There's going to be quite a lot of trouble about this. So again, it's something to look at in terms of the political structure, and we'll be coming back to this idea that James believed that he was king because he was chosen by God. And the same thing applies to his son, who gets his head chopped off. So it's quite important. James didn't think it was necessary, because he was king, because God had chosen him. So he didn't think he had to pay much attention to Parliament. So that structure that we looked at, that Elizabeth had developed, he was trying to break that structure. He wasn't really respecting that structure very much. He wasn't listening to other people. He often quarrelled with Parliament. Several times he'd close it. He just closed the Parliament down, say, you don't agree with me, well, you can all go home. I don't need you. Okay, so he closed Parliament down, and under his son Charles, things got even worse, leading to the Civil War, which is kind of the big event of the 17th century that we'll be talking about later on. And what's going on with England in its relationship to the rest of the world? Well, we've seen it coming close. We've seen it's already united with Wales. We've seen it coming closer to Scotland. What else is going on? It developed its navy. The navy became permanent during the time of the Tudors, and defeating the Spanish Armada was just one of its early successes. It did a lot of things during that period. We talked last week a little bit about Sir Francis Drake. He was not just he was a pirate, as I was telling you last week. For the Spanish, he was a pirate. He stole he attacked their ships and stole their treasures as they brought them back from America. And but also he did some quite amazing things, like he captained a ship in a voyage all the way around the world and lived to tell the tale. Now, there had been ships that had gone all the way around the world, but the captain had died somewhere along the route. He started and he brought the ship back. I think it took 3 years to go all the way around the world in a ship in those days. And these were little ships just powered by, the wind. And the wind would have to blow them all the way around the world. And it took 3 years for that to happen. They were good sailors, basically. They were good. All right. And their ability as sailors was crucial to the way that the British Empire was going to develop. And as you know, or I hope you realise that one big reason why I'm here talking to you today is because Britain, after this, was going to have an empire that covered the whole world, which meant that the language and the culture became huge. It spread to America, Australia, but in India today, what's the official language of India? English, Okay? I mean, it's sort of had a huge influence all the way around the world, and that's because of these ships that were able to establish contacts and colonies and to develop this sort of empire that grew up a little bit. It really grew up a little bit after our period, but we will be seeing the beginnings of the move towards the British Empire. And as we talked about last week, when it came to the Spanish Armada, the English had these lightweight ships which were smaller than the big galleons of the Spanish, and so they were able to beat the Spanish, who until then had been the masters of the sea and had had control of the whole situation. And then international trade and the East India Company, which is going to become central to the development of the British Empire, that was actually started by Queen Elizabeth in the year 1600. So we're not seeing the British Empire at all. I mean, there's no British Empire at this time. The British Empire really is something from the 18th century. Okay? But we're seeing the structures, the conditions that are going to make it possible later on for there to be an empire. All right? That's what we're seeing kind of set down here. And even, you know, inside the Tudor period, we've got the ships, we've got the company, the East India Company, we've got the things that are going to become central to the empire later on. And even some of the first colonies are established during the Tudor period, although it has to be said that these early colonies were not ultimately successful. All right? Explored in 1584, site of the first English settlements, 1585 to 1587. They didn't last at this stage, okay? They weren't able to establish permanent colonies, okay? But the first child born of English parents in America, a girl called Virginia Dare, all right, in this failed colony at that stage. But within a few years after this, you're getting successful colonies which continued and which were the beginnings, again, the beginnings of what was going to go on to be this British Empire. And from being a small country tucked away in the corner of Europe, we've got, by the end of the 16th century, we've got England establishing diplomatic ties with the Ottoman Empire, okay, in the southeast, you know, the area we now call Turkey, Iran, in that sort of area. West Africa, big trading and cultural, diplomatic stuff going on. Contact with Russia. I mean, you even have the Russian Tsar, the king of Russia, they call it a Tsar. He actually proposing to Elizabeth. Okay, I said she did nampa with all the big leaders of Europe, and even the Tsar of Russia proposed to her. All right, so from being a little country that was so isolated, just 100 years ago, the idea of contact with Russia, okay, that's a long way away. All right, but it's happening. You see, it's reaching out its sphere of influence, and its sphere of contacts is extending. You know, right into the world stage in a big way as a consequence of the Tudor period. But sticking more closely to its immediate neighbours, as we've seen, we've had the Welsh family establishing Wales as being firmly united with England, completely, you know, it's almost the same country. And then, if you remember, Henry VIII's sister married the King of Scotland, and then finally her great-grandson becomes the King of England. So you get that relationship with Scotland. And the other thing that brings Scotland and England together at this time is that they're both Protestant countries. Okay? We saw last week how Mary, Queen of Scots, was a Catholic, and she was pushed away by her people, partly because she was a Catholic, but also because she got involved in a scandalous murder situation, and so she was pushed out, and Scotland became firmly Protestant, and that also helped to bring it into kind of cultural and political unity with England. Ireland, well, you know, it was further away, it was across the water, it was more difficult to control, but from the time of Henry VIII, there were many, it says blood conflicts, but it's meant to say bloody conflicts, and there was a system of plantations set up. The plantation would be English settlements, English people or Scottish people being given large areas of land and told, well, this is your land, and you can use the local people to work on the land, and they'll pay you, you know, local people will have to pay you taxes, or they'll have to kind of accept your authority. So this was, you know, the English policy for taking control of Ireland was to set up basically the same way that they were to make their colonies later on in America and in other countries. Send people, tell them they've got control of this land, get them using local people or slave labor later on to farm the land and live on the profits, and so in that way establish control. So if we look a little bit in detail at Ireland, at the end of the 15th century, we've got this small area which is called the Pale. This is under the control of the English, only that little bit. We've got plantations that are being set up by, you know, in these areas, and we've got the Pale. You know, this is its sort of smallest extent, but it spreads out. Okay, there's a sort of like a going backwards and forwards depending on who was stronger at the time, how much area the English actually had control of. I think I've got a little guide to that. So yeah, in 1494 the Pale was pretty small, okay, just that little area, but by the time Elizabeth had died in 1603, it had grown to something like that, okay? You make sense of that map a little bit more easily, all right? And then you've got these settlements in the south and in the north, and you've only really got this area here, which the English are not able to establish their control over. Okay, so you've got these plantation areas here and here. So in the plantation areas, the English don't have full control, but they've established quite a lot of control. So they're sort of pushing their way into Ireland, bit by bit. Spain is the other country that we really want to look at relationship with as being very important, because Spain was the prime power at the time. We've already seen that Spain was beaten by the English in the Spanish Armada. They've been at war since 1585, and in 1588 they were defeated, but the fighting carried on for most of the rest of Elizabeth's life. And Spain and Ireland had joined together, and England had joined together with France and Holland against Spain. This fighting that went on at the end of that Elizabethan period really didn't achieve anything for anybody very much. And when James became king, he quickly put a stop to that war, and basically Spain at that stage made the agreement that it was not going to insist that England would tolerate Catholics, and on the other side, England agreed that it would stop attacking Spanish merchant ships like people like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh had been doing. So they came to a sort of agreement, Basically, Spain is sort of saying, yeah, we realize that we can't push you around. Okay? And England, in return, is saying, well, in that case, we'll stop attacking your merchant ships, and we'll just quietly try to live together. Basically, though, it was too late already for Spain. These pirate attacks that the English had been making on the Spanish merchant ships had a permanent effect. The Spanish were now weakened, and they could never get back to their former strength. And so what happened was that the Spanish, instead of using their own ships for their trading, they would be using English ships or Dutch ships more and more. They'd be contracting to England or contracting to Holland for their transportation across the water. So they were losing their power. Okay, so art and architecture, and generally we'll move on to sort of cultural aspects of Tudor society. We've still got today a large number of buildings that reflect the very unusual, distinctive style of the Tudor period, like this. Okay, these buildings are still standing today. They're still in use. You know, hundreds of years later, they can still be used as pubs or hotels or just as private residences. What's sort of distinctive about them is having the structural beams exposed in this way. So you've got the kind of whitewashed adobe fill-in, but you can see the actual beams structural beams sort of used in a decorative way. The main structural beams are exposed, and then you've got these smaller ones, mostly made out of oak. Okay, this sort of building. I think that one, yeah, that one's got the actual date on the top there, 1593, late Tudor. And there's Feathers Hotel. Yeah, still in use. Okay, very ornate and splendid building. And this was something that had developed over the 16th century, this style of house building. So it's very distinctive if you see buildings of this style. As I say, there are still hundreds, probably thousands of them existing over the country. And brickwork started to be used. It was just sort of the beginning of using brick as a building material. It hadn't been used before this. So not in English architecture, at least, as far as I know. Although the Romans were using it in their day, but I don't think there's anything really for 1,000 years. Bricks just weren't being used. So bricks were starting to be used. So you got buildings like this coming up at that stage as well. And yeah, church architecture. We've already seen a little bit, about it. But this is Bath Abbey, which it's actually early 16th century building, and we've got a lot of this is common to other European countries. What they often call Gothic architecture. You get things like these flying buttresses, which are again partly decorative and partly structural. You've got this arch, particular kind of distinctive arch shape. It's not unique to England at all. It's a pan-European architectural style, but you've got some very fine examples of it. Perhaps some of the really fine examples are in France or Italy, or some of them in Germany, but there are some very outstanding examples in England as well. You take a look at the inside of Christ Church Cathedral at Oxford, for example, and as I say, built with no modern machinery of any kind. And how they did this, I mean, there are actually, if you go on YouTube or something, you can see videos reconstructing how they think they probably did it. But even then, they're not sure, all right? But even with modern technology, you think, well, something like that is going to be pretty difficult to put up. This is all stonework, okay? The stone has to be shaped and fashioned into the right shape, and it's pretty impressive, I would say, especially compared to where the country had been, you know, like 100 or 150 years previously, where, you know, the majority of housing and so on was relatively simple. Here we've got some of the artwork, actually in this case inside one of the cathedrals. Quite often these works of Tudor art are painted on walls, so that this is a panel wall painting in Chichester Cathedral, and it's showing Henry VIII giving his protection to the cathedral. He's saying this cathedral is under my protection, which was another way of saying it was under his control, but they express it in that way, that he was protecting the cathedral. There's a lot of complicated symbolism in paintings like this, which an art historian would be able to tell you about better than me, but you take a look at something like this. This is, you know, Elizabeth I. So they didn't, of course, have cameras, and the art of portrait painting fulfilled some of the function that a camera would have today. Only rich people would be able to be immortalized in that way. This is painted by Isaac Oliver. It's called the Rainbow Portrait because of the colors in it. But what stands out in this kind of portrait is that there's a complex sort of symbolism going on. As I say, an art historian would give a more detailed account of it than I can, but if you look at the jeweled serpent here on her arm, all right, what's she doing with a snake on her arm, you might want to ask. Well, it's not a tattoo or anything. Obviously, she didn't have anything on her arm as such. Why do they put it there? What's the point of putting a jeweled serpent? The serpent symbolizes wisdom. And the ruby, okay, you see the red ruby there, that symbolizes the Queen's heart. And the symbolism here is that her passion, the passion of her heart, is controlled by her wisdom. She's somebody who does not let her passions control her. Her wisdom reigns above her passions. Of course, we remember her, she didn't get married, and that's part of the reason for putting it there. She considered her political situation and her policies as more important than marrying anybody. Her head was always in control of her heart. So I do go for these funny little details just to keep people on their toes. I don't think they mean anything this week. There's no print for you to fill it in on. So but anyway, there you go. There she is. You've also got like football. Okay, I mean I can't. Football had existed since the Middle Ages, but in the Middle Ages, football was a really wild thing where two villages, a few miles apart, would say, okay, our gang is going to get into your village, and we're going to get our. I don't even know what the rules were. Apparently, it was such a dangerous game that the government made it illegal for quite long periods, and people would get killed playing this supposed game, which was a sort of way of showing rivalry between villages. By the Tudor period, it's become more like a little bit more like you can see goalposts. And you can see it's played in a relatively smaller area than today, if we're to believe the scale there, although it might not be true to scale. But it's developing into something more like the game that we know. Also interesting that we've actually got a painting of it from that time. Okay, so we can see, you know, little details of the life that we know today as being part of England and British culture, kind of getting started in the Tudor period. Okay, so music. Although, you know, if I asked you to tell me the names of some famous musicians, you'd tell me Mozart, wouldn't you? You'd tell me Beethoven, Bach, Schubert, Tchaikovsky. Name me an English one. Ah. Did you ever think about that? Well, the Beatles. Okay, but I mean, seriously, if you're thinking about classical music, you're not really thinking English, are you? You know, you've got French, Italian, German, Russian, but you don't really think English. Okay, and it's true that when you get to the sort of orchestral, famous period of classical music, there aren't really very many English names. There are one or two in the 19th century, but you know, there's not that much. But if you're going to the earlier period, this period of the 16th century, early 17th century, you've got a high level of early music that's not so famous today. We call it chamber music. When we think of classical music, we think of orchestral music with big orchestras. Chamber music would be like 4 musicians, 6, 8, 10 or 12 would be a big, you know, a large number. Or simply one instrument playing by itself. So actually, inside that context of what we call chamber music, or you know, early modern music, there were some quite famous musicians, but that style of music, we just don't remember it so much these days. So people like William Byrd as the most famous, Tallis, Morley, Dowland, and the instruments were, you know, the most popular instrument was a virginal, which was a kind of harpsichord, a forerunner to the piano. Hold on a minute. What's going on here? Can I just go back here? I don't seem to have... The audio's not coming through. Oh yeah, there it is. It's a bit quiet. Okay, so you've got this kind of you know, pre-classical concert music, and it's quite well respected inside its context, but it's not something that we particularly remember or celebrate today. Some people may be interested in it, and then I'll just show you a little bit the kinds of instruments that they had. Wind instruments, stringed instruments, percussion instruments. They're all looking a little bit different from the instruments that we've got today, but quite often they are the early cousins or the ancestors of our modern instruments. Okay, so you can see these, well, the harp we still have. You can see that this is a sort of ancestor of the, sorry, this one's an ancestor of the violin, this one's an ancestor of the guitar. Oh no, sorry, this one's all another type of violin type instrument. And this is fretted. To be honest, I'm not sure. I'm not a big expert in early modern music or indeed in music in general. But you can sort of see the forerunner to the violin and the guitar in this kind of stringed instrument. Okay, I'll move on to church music, because that was the other type of music that was, pretty well developed at that time. And again, William Byrd was one of the major composers, so we listen to a piece from him. Okay, all very nice, but it probably made you feel sleepy more than anything. Yeah, it's okay. It has the same effect on me, actually. Don't worry about it. It's pleasant. But one thing you might want to notice about it is that even though it's the Reformation, the singing is still usually in Latin. So anyway, so we've got music in that way, and finally, I'll move on to literature. Oh, sorry, that was. I don't know what I've done here. I think the music was supposed to carry on while we were listening to while we were watching these change of pictures, but somehow I messed up the presentation. So yeah, it's just taking us through a number of churches from that period. It was supposed to be going on while we were listening to that little bit of music, but it didn't work out that way. Okay, so let's just move on. As you can see, the sort of paintings that were inside the church and the church buildings themselves. Okay, and so as I say, I'd like to move on and look at literature as the final part of this presentation. Of course, a huge amount is going on in literature. It's the age of Shakespeare. But there were also travel books going on, being written. This is an age of exploration, an age of discovery. We talked about those ships. Some of the people on those ships were going away, seeing the world and writing about it, bringing it back and putting it into books for people to read about. So Samuel Purchas, Richard Hakluyt, Walter Raleigh, they are describing the outside world. Some of it's fanciful, some of it's just imaginary. Okay, they just make up stories about giants or people whose heads grow out of the middle of their stomach or crazy stuff. But other stuff is, it's true, it's real. You've got history books coming up, Stowe, Holinshead. Holinshead was the one that Shakespeare mostly used in his own writing. He often researched Holinshead's historical works to make his own dramas. You've got poetry. Thomas Wyatt, I don't know if we talked about him. He was an admirer of Anne Boleyn. If you remember, Anne Boleyn was put to death by Henry for having lovers. He was probably the only one who was a lover, but he definitely wasn't involved with her sexually. He just admired her very much. But anyway, so we've got his poetry. We've got Spenser, Sidney. We've got Lilly, Nash, Lodge, Green, Kidd, Marlowe. We've got, if you're interested in literature at all, this is an Orgong Jidai. People tend to think it's just Shakespeare, but there's an awful lot of very important writers from that time. But so you can take a look at some of them there. That's Shakespeare up here, you may recognize. But these are just some of the other writers that would have been important in their day. I know it does look like a very masculine group, and it mostly was. There's only one woman writer from this period who stands out at all. I haven't included her here. So we've got a lot of dead white men. But Henry VIII's last wife, Catherine Parr, was an accomplished writer. Elizabeth I was an accomplished writer. So part of that would come from being lucky enough to be born very, very high class, preferably a king or preferably a queen, where you get the kind of education that would enable you to be able to make a contribution like that. Mary Herbert, who was born as Mary Sidney, was actually mentioned at the time as being one of the great writers of her period. But most women got very little education at this time, and in fact, nearly all lower class people as well got pretty much no education. So education would be a privilege of the rich. And most poor people wouldn't be able to read or write. There's Mary Herbert. Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. Here he is. He's Shakespeare. I know you're all thinking, oh, it's hard, it's heavy stuff, it's going to be difficult. Well, let's try and liven it up a little bit, and let's try and get some kind of positive feeling about this. Okay. Here he is. Okay. He's right here with us. And what's he saying? Do you know what he's saying? He's saying, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" Have you ever heard those words before? Well, they're very, very famous words in English. "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? You are more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date." I won't go through the whole thing just at this stage. We'll take it line by line, all right? "Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines." Okay, he's speaking to someone. And often is his gold complexion dimmed. "And every fair from fair sometime declines," he says, "by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed." I didn't manage to say it all quickly enough for the lines there. But thy eternal summer," he says to this person, "thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And these were very, very famous words from the most famous writer in English literature, and he was living at the time of Queen Elizabeth. He's living in this Tudor period that we're talking about. So I'd like to see if we can just sort of understand a little bit about what he's saying. Do you have any idea about what he's saying at the moment? No, not really. Yeah? We don't really know what he's talking about. Okay, let's just take a look in detail at what we've got here. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. So, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Okay, I will. Thou art means you are more lovely. You are better than a summer's day. All right? Why are you better than a summer's day? Well, rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. He's now starting to talk about what's wrong. What's wrong with a summer's day that is not as good as you? Well, what are the weak points of a summer's day? Well, one of the weak points of a summer's day is rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Something like this. Okay? Summer's day isn't always so blooming great. Okay? It can be windy and rainy and horrible. Well, that doesn't look very English, does it? Because it's palm trees. You don't get many palm trees in England, but you get the idea. Okay? A summer's day is not always sunny and bright and nice. Okay? Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Okay? So he's talking about what's wrong with a summer's day. And often, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Summer's, it ends. It lasts for a few weeks and then it finishes. Now, I know here in Japan, you think, oh, summer, it's too hot. It's a terrible time of the year. But for English people, our summer is a bit like your spring. Okay, so we like summer. Okay, it's a comfortable time of the year for us. All right, so he wants summer to carry on. So what's wrong with a summer's day? Sometimes it's not such a nice day anyway. It could be windy or horrible day, and it ends. It's all too short. It ends. All right, it doesn't carry on forever. And then he says, sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. What do you think the eye of heaven is? Exactly. Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. And you know that in Japan perfectly well. Your summer is, very, very hot. But sometimes the English summer would get uncomfortably hot. All right? Sometime too hot, the eye of heaven shines. All right? And often is his gold complexion dimmed. What would that be? The gold complexion of the sun is dimmed. What would that mean? Often is his gold complexion dimmed. The gold complexion, the golden face of the sun is dimmed. You can't see it. Because sometimes a summer's day is cloudy. Okay? All right? So his gold complexion is, the golden complexion of the sun is dimmed and you can't see the sun because it's cloudy. And every fair, every beautiful thing, from being beautiful, sometime declines. What you do? Beautiful things don't last. By chance, something happens and it gets damaged, or just by nature's changing course, just naturally. Beautiful things don't last forever. Okay? So that's what's wrong with a summer's day. Okay? But shall I compare you and a summer's day? Now I've said what's wrong with a summer's day. Now I'm going to say what's right with you. Okay? He says, your eternal summer shall not fade. Thy eternal summer shall not fade. Okay? Thy eternal summer shall not fade. Wow, what an interesting thing to say. Think about that. He's saying, your eternal summer will just continue forever. Thy eternal summer shall not fade. Just go on and on and on and on. Thy eternal summer shall not fade. Okay, William. Sort of. Nantoka wakaru. But, that's kind of why. Thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession. You won't lose the beauty that you have, nor lose possession of that fair thou art. You'll never stop being beautiful. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. Death will never be able to say, I've got her, she's mine. Death shall not brag thou wanderest in his shade. Death will never take you. Okay? So your summer will go on forever. You will never die. Okay, all right. Okay, so what's wrong with a summer's day? It's too short, it's too cloudy, it's too hot, it's windy, okay. What's right with you? Your summer goes on forever and you will never die. But why not? Why not? Okay, why? How can he say that? Surely everybody dies. No, he says, in eternal lines to time thou growest. Eternal lines. What's he talking about? What does he mean? In eternal lines to time thou growest. Because of these eternal lines, she'll never die. どういう意味でしょうか? So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this. This thing, nani? This gives life to thee. Her life comes from this. And it comes from eternal lines. And because of the eternal lines and because of this, she will never die and her summer will go on forever. What are the eternal lines? What is this? Anybody got any ideas? There's not much discussion going on. A very quiet little bunch of people today. Any ideas? I'll give you a hint. Okay, here's a hint. Sorry. That's just, okay. That's your hint. What are the eternal lines? What is this that gives life to thee? What's he talking about? Anybody? No idea? Great A for the person who gets it. Does that give you an incentive? Anyway. No? We're all struck dumb today. Yeah? Yeah? Really? Well, what's inside this? What is this? This is a book. What's inside it? Writing, yeah? Now this person that he's talking about must be dead, yeah? She must have died, if it's a woman, she must have died hundreds of years ago. But he says this person never dies. This person lives in eternal lines. So he says, so long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this. So long lives this. So long lives this poem in this book. No. William Shakespeare's poem. In William Shakespeare's book. You live forever because of my poem. Okay? Do you get it? All right? So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this poem. You will always be beautiful in this poem. You will live forever in this poem. Hundreds of years later in Japan, they'll still be talking about you and thinking about you. Okay? But as long as men can breathe or eyes can see, you will always live and you always all be beautiful in my poem. He wasn't modest, you see. Okay, we got it? Yeah? All right. So that's what he's talking about there. Okay? And that's all. Okay? The presentation finishes there.